Hello, it's Aaron Wren, and my guest today on the podcast is Jon Tyson, who is the founding senior pastor of Church of the City in New York City. You can find them online at church.nyc, so you can't claim that you can't remember that link, but there is a link to it in the show notes. Jon, thank you so much for joining me.
Mate, it is a joy to talk with you.
Just so people will get a sense, where physically is Church of the City in New York?
So we are in three locations. We're in the Upper West Side on Sunday mornings at 83rd and Central Park West. We meet in a Jewish congregation up there. All during the week on 57th and 9th. So they're in Hell's Kitchen. And then on Sunday nights, we meet at Calvary St. George Episcopal Church, which is 16th and the 3rd or so down there in the East Village. So an uptown location, midtown location, and a downtown location.
Okay, great. And is this affiliated with any denomination or particular tradition or?
We are a charismatic church. It's sort of like an evangelical charismatic church, but we are not a part of a tradition. I feel sometimes there's times I feel great about that. And there's times I feel sad about that. It's because I came from a non-denominational charismatic church. If I was a Lutheran, I would have planted a Lutheran church. Presbyterian, I would have planted a Presbyterian church. Turns out it's quite a bit of work to go join a denomination, particularly in
Right.
terms of theological accrediting. And so we just sort of launched and that's what it is. But yeah.
When did you found the church?
So I moved to New York in 2005 to plant a church. And over the years, it's been through several different forms. Church of the City, in its current state, was planted in 2017. And but to be honest with you, it's really been defined by a post-COVID church. So my life, even though I've had several different seasons, it's really pre-COVID and post-COVID in terms of pastoring in the city. They're very, very different. So yeah, really, we didn't meet for 16 months. And when we came back, I didn't recognize the church because there were so many new people and so many people had left the city. So yeah, it sort of in its current form has really taken life post-COVID. So
Yeah, that's one of the things. A lot of people who aren't from New York City haven't lived there. There is a lot that's different about it. One of them is just the incredible population churn
yeah,
of the city. And New York's not the only place that's like this. I happened to visit the church I attended in Chicago in Easter 2023, I think it was. And it'd been like 11 years since I'd gone there. And not a single person was left a decade later, other than the
wow,
pastor. He's the only person I
wow,
knew from being there.
wow.
How do you deal with the population churn of congregants?
Well, that is in all honesty, the most definitive factor in terms of ministry and discipleship for us. The churn has increased post-COVID. The rates of rent are at historic highs. One of the ways that your wife described it in the questions you sent over to me, I was like, oh, she gets it. That is written by someone who has built friendships in New York. The biggest challenge, there's two challenges. One is the amount of time you have with which to disciple people, whether they're a new believer or they're somebody who joins your congregation with a previous Christian life. You just don't get them long enough in many ways to play a definitive role in their spiritual formation. They're often very, very busy in the first place, being in New York with their jobs. And so there's a sense of frustration of like, oh, if we just had you for another 2 years, oh, we're seeing real progress in this area, or um, I refuse to just be a chaplain for people's vocational ambitions, which is often the role they want to put me in, which is, yeah, I'm here really to do something else, and I like you being in the background to give me sort of a spiritual comfort.
Hmm.
I don't like that, and the city often produces that dynamic. The hardest tension, though, I think, is to perpetually open your heart, knowing that people are going to leave. It is hard to have an unlimited flow of love with which to continually redistribute to people who you meet them. Now, on paper and theologically, everyone should say, well, of course, we're all called to have an unlimited flow of love like Christ. And I say, well, you've never pastored in New York then, because it turns out the human relational dynamic of getting to know one another, building trust, being willing to be vulnerable, growing over time is actually a very challenging component. So that's the biggest thing. People say, what do you think is your biggest threat? Is there going to be a sex scandal or a money scandal? My answer is like, God willing, I don't think so. The biggest thing will be fatigue of love because everybody leaves. Even, relationally, when you were younger, when you're dating, if someone breaks up with you, they have psychologically prepared themselves to move on and begin another life. But the person who was broken up with is often sitting there going, was it me? Could I have worked harder? You were the person perpetually being broken up with in New York. So there is that sense of challenge. So how do we respond to that? We ask God for increasing grace. We ask God to increase our capacity to love and to give ourselves away. So that's a deep reliance on the Spirit's work within us. But then secondly, we realize we're not going to change this dynamic. I went through a period where I was like, let's tell everybody to stay, and actually produced an unintended sense of guilt and shame whenever people left. Like they felt like failures. I've really backed off that position, though I still try and model an inspiring sort of commitment. And now we just try and view it as like, hey, Lord, you're sovereign. These are your people, not ours. This is a season of their life. How do we make this one of the best life-giving seasons of their life? So we build around transients and try and come up with a way to send them. Our vision is that when people show up at churches around America when they leave, other pastors say, thank you, Church of the City, because the impact you had on those people in terms of people being missionally minded, servanthood, their rich devotional lives, thoughtful vocational engagement. This is a gift from your church to ours. So we're trying to equip people and send them rather than shame them and let them sneak out the back door.
Well, one of the things I learned, I was in New York for 5 years, is that people quickly learn to calibrate their investment in relationships. And you mentioned my wife's question. I pointed this out because we had a young child, and you're like bonding with other young mothers, and you think you're building these relationships, and then they leave. And then it happens again, and it happens again. And then when you know it, we were the ones that left. So we went poof too, just like everybody else. And so it really is hard to invest and to just give and give and give when eventually this person one day is going to turn into a pumpkin.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, it is that's a part of the call, I think, in ministering in a place like this. Lots of other folks, I think college ministers experience this. And I would say this, New York is disproportionately transient to other places. No matter, the last research I read, you probably know better than me, the typical American moves every 6 years. People are more transient than they've ever been. Very rarely do people make whole life relational decisions with a vision of social capital. Staying, being known, building trust in communities over time. They just go where they work. And because work's become so volatile and unstable and people advance their careers, they move a lot anyway. So it's a problem I think a lot of pastors and just a lot of people feel. It is definitely acute in New York, though. So I accept it, ask for grace, and try and equip people the best we can with the time we have.
You'd mentioned like pre-COVID, post-COVID were very different. We providentially left New York in December 2019. So
Stop it.
right before COVID hit. And so what has changed in the city and in ministry in the city in the post-COVID world?
Well, it's not just dynamics related to COVID. COVID did a reset where many of the things that were slowly happening sort of happened all at once. Okay. So you talk about ministering or living in a negative world. That is 100% true. There is a oppositional stance people have towards the Christian faith. I think several years back, Gabe Lyons and Kinnaman wrote a book called Good Faith. And they said, based on their research, that Christians are viewed as extreme and weird, I think, with the two. There might have been another descriptive word, but I think that is very, very clear. So I've been pastoring here for 20 years. And 20 years ago, a Christian held some kind of cultural power in a person's life. So I remember very, very clearly talking to the LGBTQ community. They had a sense of shame and powerlessness, and coming to the church, you do a meeting with someone, have coffee with someone, and the thing they wanted to let you know was, I'm gay, is there a place for me? Those conversations now, the entire power dynamic is been reversed, where the typical person feels empowered, sexual minorities speak from a posture of cultural power, and then meet with a pastor and make demands on whether or not the church is inclusive. Every dynamic that sort of empowers the oppositional stance or suspicion towards the church has been highlighted radically. It's a combination of increased secularism. It's a combination of massive cultural mistrust of institutions. The failures amongst Christian leaders have not helped. And it's also generational. Gen Z, who are really rising. I have 2 Gen Z children who are rising in the workplace, have a different vision of life than even millennials, which is primarily what I was pastoring before. And certainly Gen X, I'm Gen X, and boomers. So there's a sort of a Venn diagram of cultural change that was accelerated and implemented post-COVID that's made it present and immediate, whereas before it was slowly moving in that direction. So yeah, it's rapid cultural change, incredible differences. I also think post-COVID, my guess would be, this is an informed opinion, but it is still anecdotal, that maybe close to 70% of the work done under Keller and other pastors like him in the last 35 years was done away with in COVID in a single blow. The amount of church plants that closed, the amount of Christians that left the city, a lot of those long-termers left the city, the ones who'd been hanging on. And I was just at a pastor's gathering last week, and I was just like, where's the rest of the crew? And the answer was sort of, they're all gone now. And pre-COVID, I would probably have at least more than once a month, sometimes weekly, a pastor reach out to me and say, we're moving to New York City. Do you have time to catch up and, give me new wisdom? And last week was the first time since COVID someone reached out to me and said, I'm thinking about planting a church in New York. Now, it doesn't mean that every person planting in New York is being mediated through me, but we certainly are a large influential church in the middle of New York City that most people will reach out to as a cultural reference point of church planting in the city. So yeah, big, so much has just been taken out by the tide of what was established and settled. And there's a lot of sadness in that, because I was there for a good, glorious 20-year run, and I saw many, many remarkable things happen, many of which have stalled out or declined in that time. So if you're a Christian, we need you in New York more than ever.
So you're saying, just to get this right, that a lot of the churches did close during COVID, permanently close.
Yes. Tremendous
and then
amount.
The number of people starting new churches appears to have really precipitously fallen, because it was kind of a hot place to go start a church for a while. Is that true?
It definitely. Yeah, no, it definitely is. City centers, I think Keller had a tremendous impact on this. I hadn't really heard of Tim Keller before I moved to New York. I'd heard of David Wilkerson and the cross and the switchblade. I wasn't running out of a theology of the city. I was running out of a, can God reach this sort of hard city? There was a season where, there was churches starting all the time with tremendous amounts of funding and backing. And I think part of it, on top of that, I haven't met a Gen Z. I think back in my ministry circles pre-COVID, the thing you did when you went into ministry was plant a church. That was the particular niche. No one was like, I want to plant a small Southern Baptist church in a regional part of Texas coming out of seminary. People wanted to go to places that mattered, and they wanted to start churches. Very few Gen Z Christian leaders I meet want to start churches. It's like Gen Z was a thing with millennials. I do not perceive it to be a thing with Gen Z at all. And when I talk with my friends, again, small sample size, but an informed level of that sample size, I don't meet any folks who are in Gen Z who are like, my burning desire is to plant a church. So I think there's been a decline in church planting as a whole, particularly in places like New York, which tend to be hard.
That's interesting. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on Gen Z. Why do you think it is that they've turned away from church planting? Because my observation is there's a lot of negativity around Gen Z that, oh, they're all mired in their devices, they're mentally ill. And there's some of that, but I think the best of Gen Z are the best we've had in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And you read about things like the Gundo, which is the startup scene in El Segundo.
Yes, I read your article on it. Very interesting.
Where it's, young people are like optimistic, founding things, doing constructive things, but you're saying they're not going into church planting. I'm curious why you think they've turned away from that particularly.
I think there's been so much mistrust with pastoral failures, from Ravi to Carl Lentz, and there's dozens of other ones. There's been so much church hurt. I think churches have taken trauma lightly. They've engaged in cultural issues without much compassion. And I think a lot of folks sort of think like, hey, Jesus didn't say, seek first the church and I'll build the kingdom. Jesus said, seek first the kingdom and I'll build my church. And I think a lot of folks have a kingdom vision, not a church vision. And so they want to, go into entrepreneurship or the arts or creativity or whatever it is with more of a kingdom and missional lens, but they just don't interpret that lens being through the official ordination and challenges of starting a church community. So I think I have two Gen Z kids. My son's 24. My daughter's just about to turn 22. I agree that COVID was hard for both my kids, but their level of optimism and possibility, they're stuck to their phones, but there's a lot more to them than that. And I am very hopeful about Gen Z. I just don't see a lot of it. And also, church planting is tremendously hard work. I do see a little bit of a trend of pastoral transitions. There's a lot of boomers and Xers are handing off their church. I see folks going, hang on. It's like our story. I've been here 20 years. I still don't own a building. We pack up and tear down every single week. That just gets old. And, when you transition to church, you may inherit a building immediately with money in the bank. And then it's a change management kind of leadership rather than a pioneering leadership. And I think a lot of other folks view that as desirable or something that will accelerate you in some options. So I do see folks going into church transitions with healthy congregations. But I don't know. I think the church is damaged. A lot of blemishes on the bride right now, and it's just not a place people want to give the energy of their youth towards formally leading.
What else do people need to know about Gen Z? Because I feel for much of the last 25 years, it's been millennial. Here's what you need to know about the millennials.
Yeah.
Now we have this other generation. What do people need to know about them?
Well, I'll just say that many other people could speak to that better than me. Though I did look, 80% of our church, I think, is Gen Z or something. So very, very young church. Majority of our church is in the 20s, early 30s. To be honest with you, I think the one thing, here's what we need to know, is that Christians are always late in addressing generational issues. And we should probably be talking about Gen Alpha as much as we're talking about Gen Z, because we were late on millennials. We were late. Everyone's talking about millennials. I was like, some millennials have minivans and 3 kids. We need to be talking about Gen Z. I feel that urgency right now. It depends on how you count it, but there's definitely Gen Z in their mid-20s. I think, to be honest with you, I'm a little more interested in Gen Alpha and how they're sort of coming up. What do we need to know about Gen Z? They're not lazy. They're not lazy like I think people often say about them, but I don't think they're deeply drawn to formal institutions. I don't think the thought of just like getting in an organized corporate headquarters and climbing feels like a desirable pathway for them. I think there's a lot more innovation and creativity. I think they're not looking to live their lives chronologically like a lot of other folks have. I don't see a lot of young marriage amongst Gen Z. It's kind of like you make your life work and take it stage by stage rather than with a formal plan. Though obviously, culture works where there's trends and then there's counter trends. And, most of the change is in the trends and the counter trends. So there is counter trends. I just read an in-depth study by a marketing agency on Gen Z, and they're basically saying Gen Z is going to be traditional. Women are going to get married young and have kids, and it's just basically the counter trend to a completely sort of autonomous, non-linear vision of life that they were handed. So I think that trend component will sort of show up too. I think the latest research, 30% of Gen Z identifies LGBTQ in their orientation. I actually don't believe that's like legitimately true about their sexual desires. Um, that's not what human history has revealed about the statistics of population. There definitely feels like to me there's some sort of mimetic desire in there that's being sort of some social priming plus mimetic desire that's functioning there. A part of it, I think, is a little bit of it is connected to justice, because no one wants to be sort of like a straight white person. I mean, that's sort of like a social pariah a little bit. And if you can opt out of that by being in a more desirable social category, by literally just making a statement, I think a lot of folks feel that. Obviously there is an exploration in sexuality, but I do think there are some social factors sort of pushing that. Yeah, I mean, I think that's about my biggest observations.
Well, you think about it, if you have 80% of your congregation as who are Gen Z, and all the turnover that you have, you basically have to reinvent your ministry constantly to appeal to constantly changing times, just given the nature of the demographics there.
I feel this acutely. Okay, so our Sunday morning service. So I'll try and give you some statistics. Okay, so I don't now know our exact average attendance on Sunday morning in the Upper West Side, but my guess is it's between 1,100 and 1,300 adults. Okay, and on a good Sunday, we'll have 100 kids. Okay, now if you take that church and you put it in the suburbs, a church of that size will have 400 kids or 450 kids. But I say for us, the Upper West Side feels like our old congregation. That's if you have children, that's where you go. Upper West Side's a neighborhood where, it is a great place for families to live.
My friend calls it the place that you move when your wife wants to move to the suburbs, but the husband's not quite ready yet.
Yeah, that's it. Yes. Well, we say Brooklyn is the place you move to right before you move to Franklin, Tennessee.
Yeah.
If you stay in the Upper West Side, you got a few more years there. So that feels more stable, more rooted careers, probably third job out of college, fourth job out of college. Our Sunday night congregation feels vastly different, and it's vastly different to preach to. So I'll give you an example. I did 2 series earlier this year. I did a series on the 7 deadly sins, and then I did a series called Controversial Faith, sort of the hardest questions Christianity answers. So on Sunday mornings, there was incredible resonance around the controversial faith series, exclusivity of Jesus. Why does God care what I do with my sexuality? Isn't the Bible a book of oppression and injustice? Sunday morning, older folks really tuned in on sort of classical apologetics with a fresh angle. On Sunday night, those talks just were flat, no traction, no. But when I preach on the 7 deadly sins, which activate shame, way less response on Sunday morning, massive response on Sunday night, because I felt like it sort of hit the acute needs of the heart. I preached on lust for an hour. And think about this, in a public altar call in New York City, over 150 people came forward. Wow. I mean, that is a staggering public response, asking for prayer for lust. So it just felt like the issues of the heart hit very close to home with our younger congregation, and the issues of the mind were still, with our older folks, probably more millennials, like a little more intriguing to them. So Sunday morning, I'm preaching in Keller's old world, the tail end of Keller's old world, and on Sunday night, I'm preaching to an entirely different reality. Yeah, wow. So I feel that pressure to contextualize and sort of help the gospel make its way to the heart through perhaps some slightly different pathways, that sort of a thing.
We've been talking a lot about the ways that New York City is sort of unique and different from a lot of other places. I heard you make a comment one time that I hope I interpreted this correctly, but that you seem to say that there's actually less cultural gap between New York and the rest of the country today than there used to be because of social media. Did I catch that correctly?
That is correct. Yes, I do believe there's been somewhat of a cultural flattening. And I think Gen Z and younger, in many ways, are more molded by social reality than they are by physical place. So, a kid, I'll give an example. I went and preached. I've historically, somewhat been able to resonate with younger folks. I'm 47. I'm not young in any sense of the word, but I've been able to connect with younger leaders where they've said, "I feel like you understand my world," which is sort of post-Christian secular. I was preaching at a church in Athens, Georgia, and often when you preach, there's a line of folks who want to, meet you or say hello or whatever. And it was really, really interesting because all the millennials said, "Thanks, man. I really appreciated your talk." And then they want to do New York banter. "Hey, have you tried this pizza shop?" Or, "Oh, we went and saw a show on Broadway." So they enjoyed the talk, but were not moved by the talk. And when I talked to the college kids, they were weeping and they say, "This is the first time in this church I felt like someone understood my world." So my simple point is, their world on the college campus is the secular world I preach to in New York City. And I think most folks who have at least an undergraduate level of education have gotten a post-Christian secular education in America. And New York, in many ways, has been like that for many, many years. And so I think there is a flattening in distribution. There's some distinctives. I mean, there's still some distinctives. Place definitely impacts you. The built environment obviously has a formative power over you. But I do think that a 19-year-old in Georgia and a 19-year-old in New York City have a lot more in common than a 50-year-old in Georgia and a 50-year-old in Manhattan. Like there's something where they're drawing from shared cultural sources. You think about the old days. Here's the New Yorker. Sunday morning, they pick up a 1-pound New York Times Sunday edition, and they make a French press and slowly make their way through their favorite components. No 19-year-old's doing that, mate. You're opening your phone, you're scrolling on the same viral trends on social media, and you're watching the same shows on shared media. So I do think there's differences, but there has been a tremendous flattening.
Well, there certainly has been incredible acceleration of cultural change driven by social media. Some new trend gets hot on social media. Everybody starts imitating it immediately. The influencer, I think, world that social media creates sort of promotes that because something happens, something gets hot, and everybody else tries to replicate it, and that just accelerates the pace of cultural change. Whereas it used to be if you had something like the Stonewall riots in 1969, I think, or the demolition of Penn Station, which sort of catalyzed historic preservation, it might take decades for the cultural changes that were happening in New York to percolate out to Iowa. And now it can go at the speed of light, in some respects.
Yeah, and I think that goes both ways. What's happening in Iowa may impact what happens in Manhattan amongst young folks, particularly high school students. I mean, I just came back from youth camp. I visited our students who are away on camp. And I had just come back from preaching in Iceland, which is one of the most secular countries on earth. And the students in Iceland were almost identical to the students on our youth camp. So two Christian events, but almost identical media, almost the same cultural reference points when praying with the students. Now, part of it is because of the stage of psychological development. They're going to be going through there's distinct teenage issues. But taking those out of the equation, there were still very, very marked overlaps of shared reference points in culture, music, TV, themes, etc. That I was like, oh, wow, these are different countries, different languages. There's a lot happening that's very similar here. So,
what are people's biggest misconceptions about New York?
On a surface level, New Yorkers are mean. New Yorkers are mean. They're not mean. They're just busy. And so if you try and get someone's help, when they're late for work, that's not going to help you. It's like driving down, an interstate and then saying, why won't anybody stop? It's like, because they're going somewhere, because there's no cars in New York. So you just get the human interaction.
I just wrote an article a little bit about that aspect of like the stereotype of New York is, I'm going to F you up if you F and do that again. All that stuff. People don't talk like that in New York anymore. Or maybe they do post-pandemic, but it's like the old idea of the mean streets, they're not quite as mean as they used to be.
That is true. That is true. So I'm sort of sidestepping your question a little bit to make one observation that I think has radical. So we're here in Hell's Kitchen. I'm in Hell's Kitchen. One thing that has radically shifted our city is the migrant population. That has changed the radical dynamics of Midtown. So they put, I think it's 100,000 people in under 2 years in New York. I think about that. That's the size of the majority of American towns. So they've put them in the middle of New York. These people are in hotels. A lot of them haven't got their work situation solved yet. They've legalized marijuana in New York. And so one of the dominant realities is you've got delivery men sitting all the way up 8th Avenue, 9th Avenue, smoking marijuana between jobs. And the amount of people who would say New York smells like weed now, it's a definitive factor, particularly in Midtown. People say, I went to New York, I went and saw a show, the whole place smelled like weed. I think that crisis, it's never healthy to have a large pool of men struggling with employment sitting around in the streets. That's not a good social dynamic. And many of them, it's not their fault. You talk with some of these folks, our church has helped them. They've made tremendous sacrifices to get here. If you humanize the journey of a migrant and ask, where did you come from and how long did it take you to get here? It's very, very different than seeing a statistic in a culture war. But that has changed the dynamic, particularly of Midtown West. What else? I mean, New York is a beautiful city. If you've never been here, whenever people come to Central Park, they're often dumbfounded at how large it is. I mean, you can be in the bramble in the middle of Central Park and to be like, where am I? And I feel like I'm in the woods. Particularly at the top. When we first moved to New York, we lived at 103rd in the Upper West Side, and we would walk into Central Park by this beautiful pond, and it was like being in the English countryside. It was breathtaking. So, I think New Yorkers, and I will say this, on a meta level, New Yorkers are ideologically opposed to the gospel. On a personal level, I find people very open to discussions of faith. So I'm constantly amazed that at the openness of people to conversations about faith. I mentioned this in a sermon a couple of weeks ago. The God of the gaps theory basically says Christians, because there was all gaps in our scientific knowledge, Christians put God in the middle of it to explain everything. Now we're almost at the opposite component where we have filled in so many gaps. People are realizing scientific rationalism now has shown us that this is not enough to build a life on. And people are looking beyond those filled in gaps to something mysterious, and it's God beyond the gaps. Like we've filled most of the gaps in, and this is not working for the human heart. So I find a lot of people going, I thought it would be better than this. It's what Charles Taylor calls the malaise of immanence. We've flattened everything, and there's just no meaningful moments. Someone's like, I'm sitting here at my son's bar mitzvah and I feel nothing in my heart. This should be the biggest moment of his life. And I'm like, is this really just a huge accident? I find people tremendously open for conversations about meaning. There's a lot of cultural despair, particularly about the American political system. Is this what we have to do every 4 years, get someone we can't respect in office and just fight? Come on, there's got to be more to life than this. So we're seeing a lot of openness to the gospel on an individual level. So New Yorkers is that scary, closed, God-hating. Those people are there, but those people are also in Toledo, Ohio as well. So,
you sort of mentioned that there's scientific rationalism isn't enough. And one of the things, Rod Dreher's new book is about this. One of the things that I see is this growing quest for reenchantment. Yes. You see it in like psychedelics. People want to go on their ayahuasca trips, or they want to do microdose LSD, or they're getting into Astrology is making a comeback. Many of these things have a sort of a quest to find some spiritual meaning in this world. Are you seeing that, and how do you engage on that? As a pastor, is that an opportunity to speak to people, or is it how does that affect ministry?
Yes. Witch talk, Wicca is having an absolute rise on TikTok. This is perfect fuel for pastors to literally say, that hunger that's in your heart. It's Augustine's classic quote. We talk about the second hand of it. You've made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless. People emphasize the restless part. I like the front part. You were made for a relationship with God. You've made us for yourself. And there's a relationship you were born for that you are not accessing. And that thirst for a sense of connection and belonging and identity will haunt you all your days until you find it in God. And so I think it is definitely a chance to say that hunger is good. See, it's true that there's got to be more to life than this. Have you considered Jesus? I think Jesus answers the longing of your heart better than that particular thing does. So I like Peter Kreeft's take on C.S. Lewis. I like an apologetics of longing. It's not the ultimate one, but I think in a cultural moment like ours, it's a very effective one because people are examining their longings because they have so many. Beyond all of our technology and our comfort and our security, we're like, this can't be it. So I think, a distinctive of certainly my approach to preaching in New York would be an appeal to the apologetics of longing. We're in a sermon series right now called Come and See. It's on Jesus I Am statements and Jesus' 7 signs. And it has had a strange resonance because just letting Jesus speak for himself is if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. I'm the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. Imagine saying, do you want to leave the darkness of your shame, guilt, confusion, despair, anxiety? Do you want to know the path of light? People are more open to like that as a cultural construct than I've seen in a long time. So yeah, I think it is a real opportunity.
The watchword in urban ministry for a long time is what I call cultural engagement. In fact, even a lot of people use that term. And the idea here is that rather than fighting with people all the time, like the culture war used to do, let's sit down and have a conversation with people. Let's show respect for the arts or the life of the mind. Let's show that Christians are not anti-science. Let's have good theologies of vocation. We can be good citizens of the city. We can love our city. We can be in the city for the city or whatever. In the post-COVID world, in this kind of negative world, what is kind of the status of cultural engagement? How do you engage the culture around you, whether that way or a different way?
Our churches, I still think there is a place for that. I mean, you can't totalize any particular apologetics or cultural approach. There will always be a place for that because there'll always be for some people for whom that is effective. I wrote a very short book called A Creative Minority, Influencing Culture Through Redemptive Participation. And that would be our church's approach. So Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs basically talked about the Jewish community's approach in exile, which it honestly is very, very similar to the concept of differentiation, which is the ability to stand on your own while remaining engaged with the world around you. So it's the tension. You don't want to syncretize and you don't want to withdraw, and it's beyond faithful presence, which is just like you're there and you're hoping something happens by being there. The subtitle, Influencing Culture Through Redemptive Participation. The word influence comes from a French word, I believe, which means to flow through. It's like it's an effortless response. When you're learning French, you're not fluent, but when you speak French, you just do it because you can. And Christians formed in the way of Jesus, showing up in the world, allowing the life of God to flow through them, is the approach that we would take. So you've got to be there to impact, but you're not demanding a cultural outcome as such. and you're not fighting for a particular agenda. You're not like, hey, look, we can do this too as Christians. Like, it's not sort of that thinking. It's sort of modeling, out narrating, trying to model through your life a way of doing this that is distinct, obviously going to be distinct, in a non-defensive posture. But there may be times you have to get in a fight. Sometimes you got to fight for stuff, or you're a coward. So there should be some culture wars. Like, you should be fighting for something. Now, some people have an antagonistic personality and they love to do it, and that's not healthy or godly. But there's some things you got to fight. You got to stand up for. And then there's other things you need to have an influence strategy for, and there's other things you need to build a cultural alternative for. So to me, it's a little bit more of a multifaceted approach, but that sort of philosophy is a model. We're probably on the other side of that as a base setting for how we think about engaging the city.
Evangelicals are sort of known for sort of in-your-face, angry culture war polemics, hardcore Republican politics, support for Donald Trump at 80% levels. These are all things that don't play in New York City. How does that broader context affect you and your church?
Well, I would definitely say this: it is not helpful. It's not helpful. I don't think it's helpful for anybody. Primarily because I don't think it's Christ-like. I think it is. It's too infused with America. I love America. I'm here by choice, but that doesn't help me at all. I often have people say, I've had people say to me, "Wow, you're a lot more intelligent than I thought for an evangelical." I've had people say, "Wow, I can't believe you're an evangelical. You're quite kind." I've definitely had people, sort of stunned that I'm not a, belligerent, angry man who feels like my rights are being forced out of me by the liberals. So yeah, it doesn't help that much. But again, New York's such a little bit of a bubble. People tend to take you more by who you are in their direct experience than some meta stereotype. And New York's always been like that. It's been like that for the gay community. It's been like that for minorities. It's the humanization of the other. That's what happens when you meet someone. You're kind of like, oh, well, my stereotypes are dropping away because I've actually met someone who embodies something different. So, but there is an undoing that you have to do based on the stereotypes that people definitely have. So yeah, it affects us not in a healthy way.
How do you talk about flashpoint cultural issues?
I try and lean into them. You owe your people as a pastor clear biblical teaching on the hardest cultural issues that exist. If you're unwilling to talk about them, I feel like there could be a fear in your heart you need to examine. And if you love your people, you are going to address the topics that are most pressing in their world. So if you go back over my preaching library over the years, I've preached on Jesus in the transgender community, Jesus in the LGBTQ community. Preached on every conversation about sex you can imagine. I've preached on politics. I've preached on mammon. I've tried to address all these issues. And to be honest with you, the number one thing I've heard it would be
What's
surprising. Thank you. Thank you for addressing this. This was really helpful. Because most people don't want to get their information off YouTube. This has been proved. The algorithm is nudging you towards extremes because that's where longer views are. And so the more you get on a particular topic, the more to the left or the right, based on where your starting point is, it will nudge you. Most people are more shepherded by the algorithm than they are by the good shepherd. It's really, really true. Cultural shepherding is a phenomenon that we are not obviously, honestly, consciously aware of. So I just try and talk about it clearly. I try and present, I try and steelman the other side. I try and preach with conviction and compassion, which is the way I believe Jesus preached. And I just try and hit it head on. And I try and do it without like being sensational or fearful or novel. Hey folks, here's the series we did this earlier this year. It was called Controversial Faith. And we did a bit of a survey on all the issues people in our congregation asked that we would address. And we just hit them head on. And people were like, thanks, that was really helpful. So I try and be clear, try and be biblical, try and be compassionate, try and be helpful. And at times it requires courage to do it. A lot of times I tell people it is harder to teach on sexuality up the street from the Stonewall riots than it is to teach, in Alabama,
Yeah.
because there's definitely a different sort of cultural dynamic there. So yeah, but God commands us to be courageous. He commands us, to have love over fear. So I just try and be clear, biblical, compassionate, and helpful.
You come from Australia. Was that an advantage or a disadvantage in becoming a church planter in New York?
I think definitely an advantage. New York, it was more of an advantage when I was in Atlanta than it was in New York. I mean, there is some sort of sense of the exotic other. Oh, I've always wanted to go to Australia. Oh, like this. But New York is so, when I lived in Atlanta, I would hear 10 times a day, "Where are you from?"
Mm-hmm.
I won't hear that a single time in New York in a day, because everyone's from somewhere else. This is an
Right.
incredibly diverse place. I also moved. I mean, again, I was in my 20s when I planted the church. And to be honest with you, if people say, "Do you feel more Australian or American?" The answer is, I feel more New York than either. And this is the longest place I've ever lived anywhere. The majority of my adult life is here. Raised both my children in Manhattan. My instincts are New York instincts deep down. Like my default settings in life are New York instincts, for good and for bad. Many people outside New York inform me when I visit them. So yeah, I think it was an advantage, but I think whatever a New Yorker is, I think when people meet me, they say, "Hey, dude, you're one of us," whatever that is. You may be a Christian version of that, but whatever those settings that make someone a New Yorker, they're my default settings, and people say real recognizes real. I think I recognize New York in others, and I believe to some degree people recognize that in me. So it was an advantage, but I think it's my time here and my work here and my longevity here is the greatest advantage. Being a consistent pastoral presence through many different seasons, I think, has been the most helpful thing. But it doesn't hurt to have a bit of an Aussie accent.
You mentioned there's been a decline in people wanting to start churches in New York. But if someone out there does want to start a church in New York, my last question will be, what advice would you give them?
My advice would be, New York is very expensive. And whatever you think it's going to cost, triple it. There's just a million ways. It's death by paper cut. The inflation's so bizarre. We're in a staff meeting earlier, and a couple of our folks are fasting, and one's a really health advocate. I was like, "How much was that smoothie?" And they're like, $11. It's like $11 for a smoothie. I remember when they were $6. I remember when they were $4.50. It's the cost of inflation. I was talking with one pastor recently who has a 3-bedroom apartment, and I said, "What are you paying for that in the Upper West Side?" It's like $9,000 a month. That's very, very common, between 7,000 and 9,000. So how much of your income are you going to make in order to allocate that percentage of it towards your rent? It's it's almost prohibitively expensive. So the cost number 2, the spiritual warfare. No one talks about this, but the spiritual warfare when you move is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. It manifests itself in family drama. I tell you, one very bizarre theme is children having repeated, uncontrollable, horrific nightmares. That is an absolute dominant theme of church planting families. And also, you need to count yourself blessed by God to have a sense of call to come to this great city and to serve here. It's an amazing space. It will grow your capacity, stretch your mind, enlarge your heart, build your skills, demand what's in you of you. So it's a place where your redemptive potential is definitely drawn out. I would tell you what Tim Keller told me the first time I met him. This is 2005. And I said to him, "I'm moving to New York to plant a church. What advice do you have for me? I'll never forget this. He said two things. Number one, you need to know that New York will always be bigger than you. If you plant a church of 100,000 people, New York will not care. Number two, you need to feel like you're bringing something unique to the kingdom ecosystem. Otherwise, just join an existing church. And it was just, it was like you, in essence, you need gospel confidence and gospel humility, to use his language. And I would say that, listen, if you're coming to New York, you need to feel like you're bringing something special that doesn't exist in the New York ecosystem, because there's some wonderful churches here. And then B, you need to realize no matter how successful you are, no one's gonna care. So in your mind, if you're like, I'm gonna go to New York and start a movement and we're gonna touch the nations, listen, man, bless your faith. At some point, that vision will be reduced to, dear God, I just pray that my neighbor who hates me because I'm a Christian will follow Jesus. Like, it's just amazing how the idealism gets pressed out of you. But you need it both, because without idealism, you won't come. But without realism, you won't stay. And so I'd say come with funding, come with humility, come with hunger, and come with a love for the city. New York can tell if you like it or not. And they tend to respond to people who like it here. So make sure you like it.
Well, that
and
was
we
amazing.
need you. Come on up. We need you. Yeah.
No, that's great. That was amazing. Thanks so much for helping keep me up to date, bringing me back up to date on some of the things that have changed in New York. I have been back since then, but it's a protean city that changes all the time. Again, my guest today has been Jon Tyson. He's the founding senior pastor of Church of the City in New York City. You can find them online at church.nyc. Jon, thank you so much for joining.
Mate, really good to chat. Thanks so much.